Now that we've got the tables set up and we've got the relationships set up within the tables, we need to look at the different types of validation that are needed. And most of the scenarios that we look at, or the databases that we're building, will need validation of some description. Now, if the database has been set up using the Dropdown Wizard for doing, that was a bit strange, set up using the Dropdown Wizard for doing foreign keys, which is what we looked at previously, then you've already got one of the validation methods that is needed, in that you've got a lookup option for looking between tables. But there are some other types of validation that we need to have as well. So let's have a quick look in the adopter table. I'm just going to delete that random phone number to start with. And let's put this into design view. So I've closed the adoption records. We'll look back at that in a minute, but let's have a look at some of the fields in here. So one of the first things that we look at doing is we look at having a limit on the number of characters that we can have in the field, or a field size restriction. And one of the best places to put this into would be something like a phone number, or possibly a gender field. And I'll show you the gender field on the fish table in a minute. But we can start off by setting the field size for a phone number to 11. So that is 11 characters that can be entered into that field size, into that field even. And as I'm recording this in the UK, I'm using UK phone numbers, and most UK phone numbers are 11 digits long. There are some out there that are 10 digits long due to an initiative that was back in, I believe, the 1990s, where people were asked to volunteer a number off the end of their phone numbers because we'd run out of phone numbers. And there are actually people out there who have phone numbers that are only 10 digits long because of that. And I have actually met someone with that. So we can set the field size to 11, and that is restricting the number of characters that can be entered into that field. Now, if I get up the, excuse me, going through my file system for a second. If I go into here and I get up this part A, it does ask you in task 4 to test the structure of the database as well. Now, one thing that I would do with the testing of this, especially as the testings that are given in this, and in fact for any database, I'm relating this to an assessment, but for any database really, I would advise doing the testing as you go, because a lot of the testing that you're going to want to do is going to be on the features that we put in to validate the information in the database. Now, I'm going through some specific ways of validation. It's not a be-all and end-all. It's not going to cover every validation method possible, but it will give some validation options. So it is worth running the testing at the same time as you are building your tables. And if you've been given a data set to work with, enter one line from that data set, enter one record from that data into your database to test that these rules work. So let's just save that table. There's nothing in there anyway, so that shouldn't make a difference. So what we have now And with the testing, we need to test extreme responses. We need to test maximum ranges and minimum ranges. And what we have now is a field that shouldn't allow us to enter more than 11 characters. So I'm going to press one of these number keys, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. That all works. I can click off that. Not a problem. There's the 11th character. So the first test, 10 characters or anything below that. 11 characters is the maximum. Yep, I can still click off that. But what you probably can't hear is when I press the one key now, nothing is happening. I can press any key on my keyboard and nothing is going in. And what I should have done if I'd actually thought about it is share the audio from the computer, but I get that many things going ping on my desktop on some days that it is usually less beneficial than it is beneficial. So that is actually now working. That has stopped us at 11 characters. So that gives us a restriction to the number of characters in the fields. We can also, with a phone number, put in an input mask, because although I've restricted this to 11 characters, I can put in 11 characters that are also text, because it's a short text field. I could mix 11 characters of numbers and letters, because it's a short text field. So we also want to put in something that will prevent users from entering data that isn't valid into our database. In this case, we want to stop them from adding letters or special characters or spaces in. All we want them to be able to put into this field is numbers. And we can do that using an input mask. And input masks are made up of various symbols. And for number fields, and for only allowing the use of numbers in a field, we use either 0 for a number that must be entered, or 9 for a number that is optional. So there is either a number there or there is nothing with a 9. And in terms of setting up an input mask for a phone number, you can put in 10 zeros. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 zeros. And to allow for the 11th number, if we're being all inclusive, we would put a 9 at the end of that. And that means the 10-digit British phone numbers are covered, and the 11 digits, which is the usual phone numbers, have got the extra space in there with that 9. If that was a 0, which is what you might think, it would give us an error. So let's just have a look at this with the 11 zeros. Yes, I want to save. And if we go into here, so the first thing you'll notice is there is an underline in that field now when I click into edit it. Then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I now can't click off. I may have also put one too many zeros in that count, but I've got this space at the end here which isn't filled, and I'm one number short. So that is now giving me an error saying that this doesn't match that input mask. I have to have a number in all of those spaces. Oh, of course, 10. No, I haven't missed one. I've forgotten how to count briefly. If I change that last one to a 9, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Yep, that's right. It's 11 characters. I change that last one to a 9. What I can now do, if I have 10 digits in my phone number, is I can take a digit, I can take a different digit out, that one out at the end, because that's where the 9 is. And now it will allow me to have the 10 digits. I couldn't, however, have 9 digits in there because the input mask says there has to be a minimum of 10 numbers entered, 10 number characters entered into that phone number. Let's just put that back in there. So that's doing an input mask. Now you have to run a check on a lot of, I would say probably on a lot more fields than you might think, but you have to check to make sure that data has been entered into fields. And there's 2 ways to check that data has been entered into a field. The easiest one, and therefore probably the laziest one, and also not the best one, is to set the required feature of a field to yes. And straight away, when you create a record that's not already been created, so this won't actually work where I did that phone number first, but straight away, when you create a record, that will give you an error saying there is no entry in this case, the forename field. But the error message that you get that you will get that will come up. So if I was to put in, let's say I added something in there, that's a forename field. That's not what I wanted to do. So I've just created a new record in here, haven't put anything in it. But when I click off, you must enter a value in the table adopter tbl underscore adopter underscore table dot adopter underscore forename field. It's a bit wordy, doesn't make a lot of sense, which is why, in fact, what I'm actually going to do is I'm just going to delete that record. Now, the next ID field where I've just deleted that will be number 3, because number 2 has already been used and therefore it can't actually be reused. So just be aware of that in a minute. So how do we make this so that the error message is easier for someone to understand? To do that, we use a validation rule. And we can do validation rules to check for a number of different occurrences. So we can check for the types of letters that have been entered in the field. We can check that the field matches a certain piece of information. We can check that information in the field sits between certain values. So for a number field, for example, maybe between 1 and 10. But what will probably be the most used validation rule that people will come across is the validation rule to check that there is information in the field. Now, in order to set this up, it's a little bit strange in the way of thinking, because we need to check that the field isn't empty. And an empty field in database speak is null. If you look down where it says validation rule on the bottom of my screen, null means that the field must be empty. In order to check that the field isn't empty, we check that the field is not null. What will happen when you click off the validation rule? It will auto-correct what you've entered if you've just put in not null to is not null, which is the full format. So we are checking that the field is not null, with null being a replacement for the word empty. We can then use the validation text to enter in an error message that we want to show. So please enter a forename. There we go. Fairly straightforward. Please enter a forename. If I save that, and I'm not going to scroll through it because I know that it breaches it because I haven't got anything in here. But if I was to then go to add a new record in, a new row into my field here, when I click off it now, it says, please enter a forename, which is the error message that we've told it we want it to show. So I can click OK on that, and let's just put, let's go Doris. Random name picked off the top of my head. Let's put Doris in there. And for the sake of completion, I'm going to put Bob into that field. So that then gives us a check that there is data in those fields. Which means at the moment, we've done a length check on the phone number. We've done a check for correct details on the phone number. We've got a presence check with the is not null on the forename. And the thing with validation rules and the input masks is there is a massive range of things that we could put in and check with these. So you will have to do some research and some looking around, because in order to go through a whole host of validation rules that you could put in, we could be here quite a long time. I usually spend a good hour and a half going over validation rules. But the last bit that we are going to look at with this, obviously I don't want to spend an hour and a half doing validation rules on a video. So the last bit we're going to look at is we're going to look at how we make a lookup that's not related to another table. So this is just a data lookup, and we do it pretty much the same way in that we would do with creating the relationships. So we can go to the Lookup Wizard, only this time we want to type in the values that we want. And then when we click next on that, it will take us straight away to a blank column. Now I'm doing this on the title. It's going to be a very brief, very non-inclusive title. So we'll have Mr., Mrs., Miss, Ms. Ooh, don't press the enter key, it does that. And we'll put in MX for gender neutral, and just so that we are encapsulating any other titles out there, we can put in other as the final option. When we press next, it's already got the label for the lookup field in there. It's already had that because we put the field name in to start with. And in most cases, we are going to want to limit the choice to this list. So they can only choose, or the user would only be able to choose what is in the list on this form. Press the finish button. And then when we save a table, and let's just check to make sure this has worked. Let's change our view to the datasheet view. And there's the list of titles that we've just typed in. And we can pick from those as a drop-down. When it comes to checking what is in a lookup list, we want to go down to the same place where we've been adding in the input masks and the validation rules, but click on the tab that says Lookup. And that will give you a whole host of options that you will have not seen before. But in there, it has a row source. So if you find that you've put everything in and you've missed something or you've misspelt it, this is where you would be able to go in and add to the list, edit the list, amend the list, and so on, without having to retype all of the values. Use the same layout, the same format. So everything is separated by a semicolon and it's in speech marks. So if I wanted to add something after other, I would put in a semicolon, speech marks, maybe let's just put new for the example, close the speech marks, save the table. I've added this new value, and what we should have now is new has been added. So if you miss one, rather than having to retype everything again, you can go and add and amend the table for any lookups from that Lookup tab at the bottom of the field properties. And I think that covers pretty much everything we need. And just to show that it is actually the same process, albeit slightly more complicated, for the lookups between tables, here is one of my foreign keys that I set the lookup from. And if I go to the lookup now, on here we can see combo box, row source type, table/query, row source, and there is the SQL code that sets up the drop down to look between the tables. And if I now go into via Doctor ID table or Doctor ID field, firstly, I'm just going to close that again, put that into that view, make sure it's saved and close it before I open the adoption records. That does help. Bob and Doris, I haven't filled any surnames in yet, but Bob and Doris both now appear on that drop down. And that lets me put in the start of the record in that table. Just as an add-on, you've probably realized that I've added this on, given that the screen will have changed suddenly. I did say that I would go back to the fish table and talk a little bit about other types of validation we can do. So things like limiting the field to one character with the gender. And I forgot to do that, so I've done this as a second section that I've added into the video. So here's the fish table. And if we look at the general properties for the field, which is down in this bottom corner here, down the bottom edge even, I've put in a few different options in here. So I've put in a field size of 1. So I'm making it so that people, when they enter information into this field, can't type in more than one letter. This cuts out typos, people hitting the wrong key when they're trying to spell a word. Or if they don't know how to spell that word, it makes it a bit easier because we're only going to look for the first letter. I've also, again, to reduce differences in data and to keep data so that it is the same throughout the database, put in an input mask for one character. Now, we saw the number 0 and 9. The capital L means that a letter must be entered, and only a letter. So this is stopping people from entering numbers into this field. It also has a greater than symbol in front of it. And the greater than symbol will force people to enter a capital letter into that field. So even if they don't press the shift key down when they're typing in whatever letters we decide we want for the gender, it will still be a capital letter when it is entered into the database. And then I've got a validation rule in this field. And for the validation rule, I've used an in expression. So in order for the data to be valid, it must be found within the values M, F, or O. And really, my validation text probably should be M for male, F for female, or O for other. And I know we're talking about the genders of fish, but we've got to allow for some variations that do occur in nature, I suppose. But I've just put in enter M, F, or O, just for the brevity of writing it in there. So now if I change my view, I've also added an adoption cost into this and set an adoption cost for each fish. And that's for doing calculations when we look at queries in the next video. So let's say I'm going to add a new fish. I'm going to call the fish Hope. Now I've got a validation. I've got an input mask in there, which is highlighted when I click in the field. And I can't enter in I can enter in the letter I. I can't enter in numbers. I could put in the letter I, but because I've got the validation rule in there, although it's acceptable by the input mask because it's only one character, I couldn't then add other characters into that. As soon as I go to click off it, having pressed maybe I instead of O, I get the validation rule warning, please enter M, F, or O come up. So I can look now, I can see that that is incorrect. If I put O in there, that will allow me to continue. And let's say the adoption cost is, let's say £25 for Hope here. Let's change it to Hopper, or Hoper, I think that actually says. And £25 with a gender of other. So that is how a combination of validation rule and input masks and field size limits will work.